One bad day, the Karen state announced the start of the Holy War, and this battle involved human monsters from the Ifon, who had black eyes and unusual physical abilities, as well as witches who summoned beasts that could use spells. And obviously, such a battle led to complete chaos throughout the earth. And there was a true saint in this world who was out of time and had received the blessing of the gods, and his body did not age and beauty was never lost from his face. This was the great priest of Charon, who spoke the following words and informed all the believing people that only the believers of the kingdom of Charon had received the sacred power of the gods, and the proof of this was the fire. Then, with a smile on his face, he said that the breath of God should carry out its judgment on the pagans, thus making it clear that all witches and human monsters should be exterminated. After his speech, the priest left the stage and was left alone with his loyal subordinate, who was now on his knees before him, at which point the priest reported that he appreciated that his interlocutor had been able to fulfill his mission in the fight against the human monsters from the Ifon. Then, looking at his interlocutor carefully, he said that people called the young man who now bowed before him a divine mace, or the strongest weapon of the Charon, and inquired whether he knew it. But after scrutinizing the young man's stern face, he said he suspected that the lad, despite his fame, would not be able to resist the witches of Tempeus. This holy knight's name was Mlar. And then the sacred knight, remembering his battles, which he experienced with human monsters, said that these creatures rely only on their physical strength, and without even thinking strategies, rushed into the attack. But afterward, I was informed that the witches, each with a different kind of ability, are not so simple and more elaborate. And now they've gone on the run en masse, and they're hiding in all corners of Tempeus, and finding each of their hiding places is no easy task, because witches are good at hiding. Then the priest asked if the holy knight had ever heard of the Great Witch, and said that this was the name of the most important witch who controlled animals, and also turned good souls into real evil. Then he scrutinized the young man bent on one knee in front of him, and wondered if such a witch did not interest him in the least with her power. For some time Mlar remained silent, not knowing what to say to such a question. Then he resolutely raised his gaze to the priestess and asked if this was what he wished, and the young man, as the priest's servant, humbly awaited his decision. At that moment, after looking at him with an insanely satisfied look, the young man said that he wanted the holy knight Mlar to find the main witch whose hallmark was her blood-red eyes, because he wanted to chop off her head and cut her body into pieces. But after carefully looking at his reflection through his glass, informed him that Mlar should have been more careful, for they say that just one look at that red-eyed witch can draw one away. The priest gave the priestess an even more attentive look with a serious face, and said that he would listen to his advice, but the saint only added that he simply could not lose such a faithful servant of God to some witch. The man said nothing, thinking about how it all sounded insanely stupid, and it was unlikely that such a powerful witch could be found. But afterward he quietly walked away and went straight away to the battle, where he gained the victory, and there he was approached by one of his loyal knights, who informed Mr. Mlar that they had checked all the witches in the area, but had found no one with red eyes. And it seems that something of the sort the young man was extremely concerned about. But with a smile he thought it was to be expected, for it was the most special of all witches. Then he reported that apparently the girl had decided to hide like some kind of rat. After that, remembering the image of the Great Witch, he thought that the witches they had defeated now and before had never been trained, yet they were insanely good at hiding, and perhaps it was all due to the power of the Great Witch, since all the witches were connected to each other. After that he coldly pulled his sword from the immobilized body of his opponent and told the knight that they should go on, and the latter only asked where they would go this time, to which Mlar calmly stated that they would go southwest this time. At this time, in some unknown forest, an excited girl ran up to the cave and wondered if she and the girl could definitely be here, but the girl convinced her that they were. Afterward, when they went inside, and an excited witch girl informed them that all the witches in the neighboring valley had been burned alive. But the Great Witch only calmly looked at her with her red eyes and asked if the girl didn't believe in her words. She only convinced her otherwise. But before she could say anything, the next moment she was dragged out of the cave by the hand of the other witches, who did not wait for her explanation at all. The witch told her that she had warned the girl many times not to make things up for herself, but she only wondered what they should do if Vienna betrayed them and went against them. But at that moment there was only the ringing laughter of another witch, who, approaching the frightened girl, said that she should listen to her carefully for the last time, because this would never happen, because the Great Witch is not like that at all, and she is on their side. But suddenly, the witch didn't even have time to think before her head was blown off by Mlar, who took her life without thinking, and everything around her was drenched in blood. Looking at the whole picture and the intimidating young man towering over her, the young witch only wondered where he had come from. Then she immediately got out of her seat and tried to run away, for she realized that she needed to warn the others. But to her great horror, as she approached the house where they all lived, she saw that the other witches had already been found and that theirs was one for just one life. Looking at all this picture, the girl could not believe that the Great Witch had abandoned them and betrayed them after all. But her thoughts were quickly cut short, as behind her back was already swung the sword of Mlar, which without thinking took her life. Then taking off his helmet, decisively shouted to his knights that all these witches' eyes should be checked, and those who would not have them read immediately should be killed. But suddenly, abruptly distracting the holy knight, one of his knights turned to him and informed him that they had found a girl with red eyes and were dragging her behind them. He only turned around excitedly, not believing in the reality of what was happening. But then in front of him, all in tears, appeared tormented Great Witch that was a beautiful-looking girl with bright scarlet-like blood eyes, which clearly was madly frightened by what was happening. And looking into her eyes, the young man immediately remembered the priest who had warned Mlar that a mere glance at the Great Witch could draw away. But he did not yield to it, and so approaching her with a menacing look in her face, he announced that at last he had been able to find her. It wasn't long before the protagonist and Mlar found themselves in the outskirts of Tempus in a fortress on the border of Charon. And at that time the girl, being in prison and day by day endured terrible tortures and suffered from wild pain, but still she was not broken and was ready to fight for her life to the end. At the same time, not caring about the girl's problems, Mlar was reviewing the documentation he had to deal with and turned to the knight and asked if he thought it was strange, because the Great Witch was so easy to capture. After that, he looked at his worker with an insanely attentive eye and asked if there was anything strange in the girl's behavior. But the man only looked away maddeningly awkwardly, for he could not bear such attention from Mlar, and reported that in all the time she had been here, they had never been able to discover anything. Mlar, hearing this, went back to his business and only informed the knight that he must be insanely careful not to relax his vigilance, and inquired if there was any news from the temple. But the knight only gazed into his calm, poised face and said that at dawn a man should arrive to take the Great Witch to the capital. Hearing this, Mlar tiredly exhaled and said that if the knight had finished his report, he could safely return to his room. But the young man was in no hurry to do so, and turned excitedly to Mlar and asked him to listen, for he had seen something strange. And then he said that on that day, when they came to the cave where the Great Witch was hiding, they noticed an insanely strange picture, when the girl stood quietly without even trying to escape, and then rolled up madly joyful laughter at this, all watching her tribeswoman burned alive, and it seemed to the knight insanely strange, so he still thought it necessary to report it. Mlar seemed to ponder his words and then remembered the day they had first met, and when the Great Witch had looked at him determinedly and said she would like to share some information with him. But eventually her voice had weakened, and she hadn't been able to say anything. Thinking back on it, the young man decided that maybe the girl was up to something, so he decided that he should be more careful. Eventually morning came, and the young man, dressing in his uniform after his sleep, asked the knight, who ran in excitedly, what had happened and why it had been so noisy since the morning, but he looked carefully into his eyes and said that he should go out and see what was going on. When the young man came to the window of his room, he saw several wagons and a man who was talking to the knight, giving him a document that was the permission of the high priest himself, and looking carefully at the excited people warned them that they should not worry about his arrival, as there would be no problems. But suddenly, looking around at his excited workers, Mlar came out and asked everyone present what had happened, but after a moment's thought he turned his attention to the culprit. Then he approached the young man. The young man, who still held the permit in his hands, looked at him carefully and recognized him as Mr. Inquisitor. Then he introduced himself. His name was Pippin that. But it didn't seem to bother Mlar at all, for without looking at him he snatched a piece of paper from his hands and then began to read the order from the high priest that he wished this man to take the great witch to the capital and execute her. It was also written in this letter that he placed all responsibility for transportation on Dr. Pippin Toth. When the sacred knight scrutinized the young man before him, it seems Mlar had some doubts. But before he could even say a word, one of his knights in armor began to lead out the gaunt Vienna, who was bound in his arms. Seeing this picture, it seemed that Mlar was madly displeased, and so glaring angrily at his knights, inquired who dared to disobey his orders and remove the bandage from the witch's head. But one of the knights only excitedly reported that Dr. Pippin Toth had said he wanted to look at her red eyes and see for himself whether it was indeed the same witch. Even the dogs barked angrily at the girl, but the great witch had a special ability, and she understood the speech of the animals, who were surprised that she really was the most important among the witches. For now she did not look like her title at all, as she was dirty. The chief witch, only slightly displeased, looked at the dogs and ordered them to shut up. And at that moment the main witch, taking advantage of the situation, freed herself from his grip, and then nobly and majestically walked on her own. But Mlar understood it not so, therefore disgruntled, looking at Dr. Pippin Toth, then returned his gaze to Vienna and reported that in all likelihood this girl was just trying to escape, and reported that it was an insanely stupid act on her part. But seeing him bare his sword, Dr. Pippin the one only asked the Inquisitor to stop, for this girl was to remain alive, and he was not to harm her. But the next moment he was aiming his sword at her throat for attack. But Vienna, only confidently looking into her eyes, calmly informed him that she wished to assist him in destroying all the witches. It seems that hearing such words the young man was madly surprised, not understanding why she was saying something like that, and trying to find out what her secret thoughts were. At that time, the other knight who was leading her grudgingly grabbed her by the shoulder and pushed her away from the Inquisitor, asking why she was talking such nonsense, because it seemed obvious to him that the girl was not going to help them. She screamed in pain as the knight's movements were quite rough on her. But the next moment the knight apologized to Mlar for the misunderstanding and was about to take her away. Then he turned her around and led her to the carriage where she was to go. But at that moment Mlar turned to her and asked Vienna why he should trust her, because it was strange for the girl to try to help destroy her own people. Everyone was madly surprised that the Inquisitor decided to talk to the prisoner, and not with a simple, but with a great witch, and were madly excited. And the other knights, turning to Mr. Mlar, asked him not to talk to her, but Vienna, only excitedly looking at him, said that she knew the location of the nearest point where witches live, and told him it was in the forest of Gavin. Then she looked more calmly and confidently at the young man and advised him. She advised him to send some men there and check it out for himself, if he didn't trust her words. But to the great surprise of everyone around, Mlar didn't ignore it, but asked his knight how long it would take to get from this place to the forest. And the latter only looked at the Inquisitor a little worriedly and said that if they went only to check the situation and return, they would only need 1 day. Looking at his knight carefully, Mlar thought for a moment and then decisively gave his order for the knights to go on a scouting mission, and he obeyed his order without question. The next moment, Mlar, addressing the knights, said that they must line up the men and also put the witch in custody, and the transportation would be delayed until they could be sure that the great witch had not lied. I think Dr. Pippin Toth was madly surprised at this and asked Mr. Mlar if he was talking about something so serious. It was an order from the high priest. But he answered nothing and still looked at the witch, who was being led away by his knights to the place of confinement, and gazing intently into her red eyes, pondered on the reason why the girl had decided to help them, if her words were not a deception. Then Mlar. A short time later he found himself at a council with other clerics, and one of them unhappily struck his fist on the table and asked Mr. Inquisitor, did he really believe such devils, who had absolutely no reason to help them. The elder priest, who had been sitting and watching the painting, agreed with the words of his colleague and said that even if the High Witch knew a lot, they should not let her live, otherwise there was no telling what she might do. Then Mlar was approached by his knight, who had previously gone on a reconnaissance mission, and reported that, despite the priest's words, the information they had received from Vienna was true. Upon hearing this, the clergyman only turned to Mlar and inquired. They had proof that she had not lied, for it was quite possible that they were already under her influence. But he only put someone's head wrapped in bandages and asked if it would suffice as evidence. It seems that from what they saw, all the priests were in great shock, not believing what they were seeing. Looking at the excited faces of the priests, Mlar explained that it took them 3 years to completely exterminate the human monsters of the Ifon, and then added that the longer the war lasts, the more casualties there will be to their state and army. So if the priests were willing to suggest some more effective way to end the war sooner, he was willing to listen to them and change his mind. But after looking them over with the sternest possible look, he said that if the priests didn't like it, then they could personally go to the front and take part in the battles. Otherwise, his decision would remain unchanged. The priest only cried out excitedly, informing Mlar that even despite her help, they could not let the witch live. But to his great surprise, the inquisitor agreed with his statement, and then informing him that he was absolutely correct, whereupon Mlar looked at Dr. Pepin Toth carefully and asked him to tell the Grand Priest that he would need more time to determine what use the Great Witch could be to them. But Dr. Pepin Toth only looked at him with an insanely scrutinizing gaze from under his mask and said that in that case they needed something to convince the High Priest. Mlar smiled at that statement and said that it would take 6 months for him to burn half of Tempus to the ground, and wondered if that would be enough. At this time, the incredibly calm girl was sitting in her cell and reacted to absolutely nothing. But suddenly a gray mouse ran up to her and bit her finger because of hunger. When suddenly interrupting her rest, the knights came in and told her that it was her time to go out. The Great Witch immediately became more serious, and the mouse ran away. Then they roughly grabbed her and began to pull her out of the cell, asking where they were to take her. But he only scrutinized the girl in front of him and told his knight that the best solution would be for him to pick up the girl himself. As a result, the High Witch found herself in Mlar's office, looking carefully in his direction, her eyes still blindfolded, waiting. The High Witch found herself in Mlar's office, looking carefully at him, her eyes still blindfolded, waiting to see what their conversation would be about. After as earnestly and grudgingly as possible reported that the place she had named last had only half the number of witches she had named. After that, she looked carefully at the excited girl and asked if she was tired of denouncing the witch, if she was tired of snitching on the witch, or perhaps she was trying to help her tribesmen, although late, but the girl reacted calmly enough to such words and said that if she wanted to help them, she would not have snitched on them and told their location from the beginning. But suddenly shocking her, Mlar asked the girl to take 5 steps forward and approach him, and she seemed madly surprised by such an order, but complied and slowly began to approach. But the next moment he rose from his seat to tear off the blindfold that covered her red eyes and gazed intently into them to report what the girl had to say, where the other shelter was. Eventually, a young man appeared before her, with a huge map in the background with the area marked with crosses where the witches had been burned. And so in 6 months they had actually managed to deal with half the witches of Tempus. After that, the excited Vienna, looking at it all, thought about how long it would take to exterminate the other half. But she didn't think about it for long. And so, approaching the map, she pointed to a new location and said that the next witch cluster was right there. But then Mlar excitedly addressed her by name and inquired. She was not called by that name. Then, seeing the shock on the Great Witch's face, he calmly explained that it was the name that the other witches kept shouting while the holy knights were dealing with them. Vienna only calmly lowered her head and thought about the fact that for the past 6 months he had only received information about the whereabouts of witches, but had never once looked into her eyes. And she wondered why Mlar had now tried to find out her name. So she calmly explained that her name was just extra information for Mlar. He looked at her shocked and for a while could not understand what to say, but then he calmly agreed and asked if the next place was a gorge. She confirmed his guess and said that this place was not far from the cliff near which their hideout was located. Then she added that if there were no witches in the place they had cleared last, they had probably decided to move away in order to escape their attack. But he just calmly looked at the agitated Vienna and told her that it had been 6 months since she had become a traitor. So if the other witches had a head on their shoulders, they would never travel the same route. But she just calmly said that witches were just stupid creatures who obeyed the devil, so they probably wouldn't change their trajectory for that reason alone. Well, then, scrutinizing Vienna to her, approached Mlar, who inquired what would happen if no one was found again, as it had happened in the former place. Whereupon the lad said that in that case, there would be no more use in the information the Great Witch was presenting to them. But she fearfully reported that there should definitely be other witches in the place, she said. And Vienna seemed to be insanely confident in her words. But in the end, because of how sharply she straightened up to say so, the girl's chains got tangled up in her hands, causing her legs to stumble, and she began to fall precipitately onto Mlar's chest, who only looked at her calmly and wondered how she could be so sure of such a thing. Then he pushed her away with such force that the fragile girl, who had been tortured more than once, fell and hit her back on the mat behind her. The inquisitor looked at Vienna and asked if she had any other way to get news while he was in the dungeon. Then he looked at her with an insanely stern look and ordered her to answer, then informed her that perhaps the main reason for all this was that no matter how many witches they exterminated, they would never completely destroy them as long as the main one was alive. Vienna seemed madly excited by what she said, but then quickly pulled herself together and calmly said that if the knights continued to do as she said, they could wipe out an entire tribe of witches. She looked up at him with a determined glance and told him with a look of scarlet eyes that there might come a time when the blue flames of Mlar would burn her to the ground. But right now she didn't want to die yet. At that moment, the young man looked at her carefully and told her that her wish would surely come true. Then he called his knight, who was waiting outside the door, and asking him to come in, ordered the girl to be taken to her room. He immediately began to carry out the order and began to enter Vienna, but the latter, only excitedly looking at the inquisitor, did not understand such behavior, and herself thought about whether this time they decided to take her not in the dungeon, and then breaking out of the hands of the knight asked where he saw her. But when she entered her room at once, she saw Dr. Toth, who looked her over carefully with a sort of smile and informed her that he had at last been able to wait to meet the Great Witch, and seemed very enthusiastic. As the knight pushed her into the room, the girl looked fearfully at Dr. Toth and did not understand what the man was doing here. The man seemed to be wildly encouraged by her fright, and only laughed when he told her that she was having an insanely strange reaction. After which he informed with a smile that he had been in charge of Vienna's treatment for half a year now, so he thought that they had already gotten a little closer. But Vienna only wondered if the treatment all this time was just an excuse to torture her even more. So she sure looked at him, wondering why he didn't come to treat her in the prison cell again, as was his usual practice. But the doctor calmly explained that the inquisitor had reported that the girl's leg had been injured, so he had offered to treat it first before discussing it. But suddenly, the excited girl noticed that in the middle of the room there was a bathtub for bathing, and was madly surprised by its presence. Seeing her worried reaction, Dr. Toth informed her that the wound was much more serious than he thought, and because of the blood and pus, he couldn't see the wound itself at all. Then, smiling slyly and wickedly, he pushed her a container of water and informed her that they would have to wash her wounds before treatment. Then he calmly sat down on a stool near the bathtub, and just as abruptly as he had thrown her into the water, he grabbed her leg and held it out to her, telling her that she shouldn't be afraid, because he would treat her wound as he had always done before, so she shouldn't worry. After that, he still smilingly informed that the girl just needed this pain to heal, and pressed on her wound. Seeing how much Vienna was in pain, he only smilingly informed that the guards in the dungeon were changed periodically for fear that the girl might use her spells, and asked if she thought that beating the guards was entirely her fault. After which he grabbed her injured leg very hard and with great pain for the girl, preventing her from moving and immobilizing her through the unbearable pain. All she could do was scream and lash out. And at the last moment she couldn't stand it and pushed him away with her foot. The Great Witch, covered in blood and wet, as well as insanely exhausted, could hardly hold back her tears in order not to show her weakness in front of such people, and she did not understand how long such attitudes to her would last. But at that moment, Dr. Pepin Toth looked at her with a manic smile and then asked the High Witch, had she managed to glamorize him with her red eyes after all? She was frightened, seeing that look, because she remembered Mlar's phrase that the former place had only half of the number of witches she had named. So she thought that maybe Dr. Pepin Toth was doing something like this because she was a bad witch whistleblower, and it was Mlar's order. But at that moment he came close to her and hovered over her, scrutinizing her face. And Vienna could not understand if Dr. Pepin Toth wanted to get rid of her because he had decided that she was no longer useful. And she realized that she had to get out of here somehow. But at that moment, Mlar suddenly burst into the room, pushing Dr. Pepin Toth away with a kick of his foot, and examining him with a stern look, waited for him to explain himself. Dr. Pepin, that one, only looked him over awkwardly and asked when the inquisitors had had time to come in here and what reason he had come. But the sacred knight only calmly informed the man that he should, as soon as possible, get out of here. He seemed not to have expected this, so he looked at Mlar excitedly and asked him to repeat what he had said. But he also calmly told him that Dr. Pepin Toth should leave this room at once. He began to tell him that he had not yet finished his treatment. But Mlar looked at him as sternly as possible and told him that from now on the treatment would take place every day at 11 o'clock a.m. and that he had to be present. Dr. Pepin Toth was still trying to object. But the Holy Knight, looking him over with an attentive eye and seemingly maddened by what he saw, inquired if he must repeat himself 3 times to him in order to get him to listen to him. Finally, the young man, unable to bear his pressure, excitedly packed up his things and left the room, and the last thing he said was to apologize to Mlar for his behavior. Vienna was still sitting in her bathtub, still agitated and unsure of how to react to such things, because she had too many thoughts in her head that she couldn't organize. Then she began to wonder if Mlar had seen everything that was happening to her and realized that it seemed like she had been in too much of a hurry when she tried to run away, and she had done so rashly, only because she wanted to get out of this situation as soon as possible. But at that moment, a young man approached her, looking her over carefully, and asked her, had she really bewitched Dr. Pepin Toth with her red eyes and thereby manifested her power? But on hearing such an accusation, the Great Witch only excitedly reported that such a thing was absolutely impossible, for there had never been any such power in her eyes, and that was all. It was just a fabrication. But Mlar was adamant, and though without anger, he looked at her frantically and wondered what was the cause, if not her eyes. For in that case, Dr. Pepin Toth had simply wanted to pounce on her for no reason. When Vienna heard such a thing, she only looked at him excitedly. Then she thought about the fact that she was completely unaware of his reasons and assumed that the reason could be because she was just a helpless girl. After listening to her words, the Holy Knight looked at the girl carefully, and Mlar asked if she was sure that she had not used any spells. Seeing the disbelief on the Holy Knight's face, Vienna thought that the young man would never understand her and that no matter what she said, he would not take her seriously. So she resolutely rose from her seat and looked at him with a crazily attentive gaze of her scarlet eyes and said that if the Holy Knight wanted to, he could check if she possessed such power himself. After all, if there really was some sinister power in her eyes, he would definitely feel it. He only scrutinized her with a sort of smile. She had now decided to bewitch him, and he seemed amused by this development. But the girl who was watching his every move thought that she had been denouncing the other witches for half a year, and Mlar had not yet begun to believe her at least a little. So a little disappointed and angry, the Great Witch said that if he continued to have doubts about her, he would at some point stop listening to her. Then she asked, as seriously as possible, if Mlar had ever felt her spell by looking into her eyes. Then she asked if Mlar was still afraid that she might attack him. But it seemed that such a phrase, casually thrown by Vienna, had struck him to the heart, so the boy, jumping up from his seat and taking her by the shoulder, so that she was looking into his eyes, wondered if she really thought she was like that. How could he be afraid of her? And afterwards informed him that even a deity would reject Vienna's cursed body, but she, calmly looking into his disgruntled face, informed him that for some reason Dr. Pepin Toth knew she was coming here. But he calmly replied that if Dr. Pepin Toth had behaved in that way, he must have had some reason. Then he pulled the girl out of the water and, lifting her up in his arms, said that in that case he must find out the reason himself, so that for that reason Vienna must always be near him. Then he put her on the bed and gave her a towel, after which he moved away from her and told her that this was her new room and she would sleep here, and that while he was working during the day she should always be near him, and asked if she needed any further clarification. The girl was only excited, looking at him, and asked why he suddenly started behaving like that, because it was completely different from his usual behavior. The man calmly explained that he had just given his reason, but still decided to repeat it. He crossed his arms over his chest and said that he wanted to make sure that Vienna didn't have some sinister power hidden in her, because they had seen her no more than 10 times in the last 6 months. So he thought he could figure it out if the girl was always near him. Then he looked at the girl with a smile and asked her if she had heard anything of Dr. Pepin Toth's story. Then he said that the great priest was soon to come here to see the girl. Eventually, after a few days, the girl became a regular visitor to his room, and so he brought her back to the room where she moved through the corridors in a blindfold. And when he took her into the room where he was working, he removed the blindfold from her eyes so that she could look around and began to work, and scrutinized the papers sent by the high priest, and thought about the fact that the high priest intended to visit them soon. And so he did not understand why the young man decided to do it so suddenly. After which to reflect. The news of his imminent arrival spread with unusual speed, so it was decided to heed the suggestion of Dr. Pepin Toth, and to help cure and put the appearance of the great witch in order. Then the man looked at the hands of the fragile girl who stood beside him and was shackled, and thought that these shackles had sacred power. So he who controls magic must feel pain when he touches them. He looked at her face and realized that she didn't look like she was in incredible pain, which raised questions. So he looked at her and asked if she was the only witch with red eyes among those who lived. But Mlar didn't even look at her and asked if she could prove it, to which Vienna calmly replied that she had no proof of such a thing. When Mlar heard such an answer, he thought that the girl was of absolutely no use, and asked if she was a great witch. She confirmed his guess, but Mlar only grudgingly inquired, "Is she really a great witch who has absolutely no power?" The girl only grudgingly inquired when this interrogation. He was not angry, but simply turned to the girl and asked her if she had done nothing to bring the grand priest here. She was madly surprised at such an accusation and did not know what to say to it, so they excitedly informed her that she had spent the last 6 months in prison. But even such an answer did not satisfy the sacred knight, who said that the girl, if she wanted to, she could cast a spell on Dr. Pepin Toth to help her do her work. Then she again said that she had no such strength at all. But at that moment the man could not stand it, and pushing her into the column, asked what was going on. If she had no strength at all, and scrutinizing her hands and the rest of her body, said that these scars looked like animal bite marks and that they had obviously appeared before the purification of the Charon had begun, and inquired, how did it happen that on the body of the great witch there were such scars? Then with all the sternness of looking at her said that in the last place that the girl named, he found very interesting records that every season witches dedicated girls, and wondered for what were these human sacrifices. But Vienna only said that they had no specific reason. Still continuing to strangle her, Mlar said that he knew that witches controlled animals and asked if they sacrificed girls to control them, and demanded an explanation as to where the terrible scars on the girl's body came from. She began to deny it and explained that Tempes had many forests and wild animals, so it was only natural that she should have such scars. But at that moment Mlar's face contorted with rage, and he said that he had previously thought that Vienne valued her life, and then asked if they should do some experiments on her after all. But at this point the girl could no longer hold back her tears, so she lowered her gaze and said that if she could control animals, she would not have obeyed anyone in the first place, nor would she have tolerated such cruelty. Looking at her at this point, Mlar noted that her pupils and lips were red and that this spoke of the ominous aura of the Great Witch. He then sharply let go of the girl, who fell to the floor exhausted. At this time, as if not paying attention to this, Mlar turned to the servant and ordered him to bring water for washing. But at that moment, seeing the servant leaving his office, one of the priests burst into the room, pushing the young man away, and going inside he inquired, "Why does the inquisitor keep the Great Witch near him?" The young man, who looked at him unhappily and thought that earlier he had felt someone else's presence, but could not understand who it was, but after gathering himself calmly explained that he kept her around in order to understand what harm she could do. The priest, seeing such a calm expression on his face, tried to reason with him and told him that it was not worth keeping the Great Witch in his office for such a thing, because she should have been kept in a dungeon with an iron bar. Then approaching the inquisitor, he said that it was very irresponsible of him to remove the shackles of the most dangerous witch of all. But Mlar only asked him to step aside. The latter was madly surprised, but he looked back calmly at what the servant had brought him, saying that he had ordered water for washing earlier, so he should have stood aside so that he would not be interrupted in his business. After that, he began to roll up his sleeves and still looked attentively at the priest, who from time to time repeated that such an attitude to the Great Witch could not be, because the Holy Knight does not realize how dangerous the girl can be, and then said that she should be given to priests like him. Then Mlar calmly asked him whether the priests want to examine the Great Witch, and even agreed to do so, but on the condition that they have no right to torture her or leave any scars on her body. Then, dipping his hands into the water, said that it is likely that the priests are able to do something similar to the girl by torturing her, but the priests only excitedly said that they are servants of God, and they can even with their prayers expel the demon's powers. But Mlar only smilingly inquired, "Is the priest going to purify the sinister creature with prayers only, not boiling water or a metal chair, or nails?" And inquired since when did priests have such abilities. Vienna was watching anxiously, and she didn't understand why she was getting worse now, and why it was happening to her again at such an inopportune moment. And after a moment her consciousness began to swim, and she tried as hard as she could to concentrate, for she realized that he could not allow something like this to happen in front of a clergyman. For this had happened to her before when she was alone. But the two men were completely oblivious to this, and so Mlar calmly informed the clergyman and explained that he should leave the use of God power to those who were entitled to it. And then he looked at him and said that people like him should be practicing prayers. And then, literally shocking the clergyman even more, he said that perhaps God would grant them sacred power if they prayed very hard. And he said this with a mockery that he did not even hide. But then the clergyman, literally flushed red with rage and anger, wondered if Mlar was about to flaunt his sacred power, and then angrily shoved him to the table where she stood with a bowl of water for washing. And all this water splashed over the girl that excitedly raised her gaze higher, but it seems her eyes were already clouded, and she realized that it looked like, but she was getting worse again, and the same thing was happening to her as always. After a moment she fainted, and Mlar bent over her excitedly and called her name, not realizing how to help her. At this time, it was as if the girl was in the body of a little mouse, who was now eating an apple and fully feeling all that she felt, and so counseling that, in retrospect, she realized that all of it, just lousy, but she realized that was how she, her mother, and even her grandmother had lived, though her life was even more horrible than their lives. But after realizing a little where she was the mouse, and with her Vienna began to walk around and look around to see what was happening to her, and where she was at the moment the animal in whose body she had taken up residence. While she heard the conversations going on between Mlar and the Great Witch about why the Great Witch still hadn't woken up, Dr. Toth reported that her body was absolutely certain to be fully recovered, but he couldn't say anything further, and might be able to clarify the information after a medical examination. When she heard the same, she ordered herself to wake up, but the mouse in whose body she was excited ran and then fell, and together with the bear the girl fell on her back, experiencing great pain that pierced her whole body. The Holy Knight and Dr. Toth were watching closely. Dr. Toth immediately tried to come closer and asked if the Great Witch was ill. The Great Witch was not well, but Mlar stopped him at once. Then approaching the girl, He simply took the blanket with which she was covering herself and found traces of blood on it. This did not go unnoticed from Dr. Pepin Toth, who inquired what was there. And the Holy Knight stated that there were now bloodstains on the duvet cover. Then Dr. Pepin Toth approached and said that this could not be so, as he had cured absolutely all the girl's wounds, and therefore it was maddeningly strange that she was now bleeding. But after Mlar had taken her hand, he saw that there were fresh scratches on it, and then looking at her injured fingers, he told Dr. Pepin Toth that the medical examination was over for the day and ordered him to leave. He tried to object, but the young man only gave him a disgruntled look that made him realize that he should listen. The remaining Mlar alone, looking at her hands carefully, said that her wounds looked like animal bites. But Vienna tried to explain as calmly as she could that she had just been bitten by mice while she was in the underground prison, and perhaps she had accidentally scraped off the caked blood. That was why the wounds were bleeding. But suddenly shocking her, the man informed her that in that case those wounds must be weeks old, and so she wouldn't have bulged so much over some minor wound. Vienna just shuddered, you see. She had managed to hide it from everyone for 6 whole months since she had gotten here, and she hadn't even given people any reason to doubt it. So she had absolutely no idea how it was that Mlar had found out about everything. At which time he, looking her over carefully, informed her that every season a witch sacrificed a girl, and inquired, was it not a mere human offering? And they seared the beasts with blood. Vienna, just shocked, looking at him, did not understand what she could answer such a thing, and did not understand how this man with such ease managed to penetrate into the very essence of what she so carefully concealed. But he only calmly looking at the excited great witch said that the blood was necessary to control the animals, and the girl that the witch sacrificed every season was it. Vienna tried to deny it, but the next moment the lamp that illuminated everything around cracked from his sacred power, for the man was madly angry. Then he said that Vienna should tell him the whole truth, for otherwise he would be even more angry, and the conversation would be different. At this point, lowering her gaze and removing her hand from the young man's grasp, the great witch informed that she was not controlling the animals at all. And that was just a one-sided response. And the response meant that she could briefly adopt the feeling of the beasts that tasted her blood, but clarified that this did not give her the right to command them at all, and the feeling occurred suddenly during sleep. So there was absolutely no use for it. Then Mlar scrutinized the girl and asked her why she was wearing so many bite marks. Why there were so many bite marks on her, if it was of no use. But the witch calmly explained that she didn't know when or what animal would respond, and it was just an attempt to increase the percentage of probability. Mlar looked closely at the girl and asked if all her denunciations of the other witches were based on such sorcery, but Vienna only excitedly began to deny and prove that it was not so. Seeing such a reaction, Mlar only smiled, wondering if it was really true, since she could borrow animal eyes, but had never once used it in all this time. He said there was no asylum and no witches in the ravine. She just couldn't understand how they got there. Then looking excitedly at the sacred knight, she said that it could not be, and the latter only calmly said that the girl said it with such conviction as if she had seen everything with her own eyes. But after looking her over with the utmost severity, informed her that if all her denunciations up to that time had not rested on witchcraft, she was to name him the new region now. And if her words were false again, the report would end, and it would end with her death. Vienna just imagined this picture and stated that her life was really lousy, but not enough to die. And the next moment she saw the image of her mother, who had tried to strangle her as a child, realizing what kind of life awaited her, and she tearfully asked her daughter to die, because it was the best option for her. Though the little great witch didn't realize it yet. But then at the last moment, the new great witch's mother was dragged away by the other witches, and the girl was taken away by the others. And the last thing the mother had time to say to her was that she had to die. And then the girl, being outside, realized that someday her day would surely come when she would be locked inside this cave, and she would spend the rest of her life dirty and missing blood. But despite her lousy life, the girl wished at least to meet death as she wished. But at that moment she was brought out of her musings by a young man who turned to her and ordered her to tell him the next place. and she immediately shouted that the next place was Tyrone Hill. She said that there must be a family of witches there, and I thought to myself that surely they must be there. Even if not all of them were there, someone must be hiding there. But suddenly, quite unexpectedly for the girl, Mlar turned to the knight who was guarding outside and ordered that all the mice that dwelt in the underground prison should be disposed of at once, and ordered that everyone should be disposed of so that none should remain. At this time, in the carriage in which the Grand Priest was traveling, he was approached by one of the sacred knights, who said that if all was well, in 10 days they would arrive at the border where the fortress is located, and asked the priest if he was worried about something. But he only stared languidly out of the window, not even giving the young man his answer, and seemed to be madly thoughtful and completely absorbed in his thoughts. But inside, the horse suddenly became furious and seemed to be frightened by something. So these said that now he would get out of the carriage in order to check. But when he opened, and it was found that in front of their carriage stood a great many people, bowing down before him, and they all asked the great priest to turn the favor of God upon them, and did not know how they should go on living. The excited knight turned to the grand priest and told him that the believers of the city that would be next on their way had gathered here, and the arrival of the priest was kept in strict secrecy. So the knight did not understand how it happened that they had learned about him. But the man only smiled and said that everything was all right, because perhaps such an encounter could be a godsend. So he said he would go out to his people. The knight tried to explain to the grand priest that if they spent time here, it would take a week longer to reach the fortress. But the grand priest hesitated. After a while, he smiled and folded his hands in a prayerful gesture, saying that he could not turn his back on the people who needed God so badly. Seeing such a radiant priest, the knight immediately apologized and said that he had been thinking too narrowly, and said that he would now go out to the crowd to restore order before his meeting with the people. And after a time, the great priest was preparing to leave the carriage, and being alone, evidently did not conceal his displeasure, his disapproval, and his hatred of the whole situation. At this time, Vienna sat on her bed and realized that a week ago, Mlar had sent an army on a military campaign for a witch hunt, but not to Tyrone Hill, but to the gorge. And then she abruptly remembered what he had informed her, namely that there was no one in the gorge, so her denunciations were untrue. And then the great witch realized that Mlar was originally just testing her, and there was originally no army in the gorge. Suddenly distracting her from her musings, Dr. Pepin that entered the room, and after saying hello to the great witch, asked if she had been living well alone all this week. The girl was obviously mad frightened and did not want to see the young man, for she knew he was dangerous to her. But afterwards she looked at him a little cautiously, but more confidently, informing him that no one was allowed to enter this room until the end of the military campaign. The man only smiled and said that the girl could not worry about it, because today he was carrying out the orders of a lord of a higher position. The girl immediately thought without understanding what it was about. But at that moment, Dr. Pepin Toth grabbed her by the leg and pulled her off, and smilingly informed her that the great witch should be glad, for they were to have a merry walk together. Then he unbuckled her shackles. In the end, that was how they walked, and the girl indignantly wondered how much longer the road would take them. Dr. Pepin Toth only informed her that the witch should not be capricious, as they were almost there. And finally, they stopped near a pit, which was completely filled with dead bodies. Looking at the whole picture, the girl absolutely did not know how she should react to it, because she was standing there watching a cesspool of corpses, and she had no idea why she was there, why she was standing there, but she already suspected whose bodies were resting there. At that moment, Dr. Pepin Toth turned to her and with a strange smile said that the great witch could not even think about running away, because there was a vast plain around them, so wherever she ran, she would be perfectly visible from everywhere. But Vienna told him she wasn't thinking about that at all, and asked him to answer her question about whether or not if there were witches in the pit, and wondered why there were so many corpses. Then confidently looking at the man, she informed him that earlier Mlar had said that one informer would be enough, and that all witches besides her would be immediately executed on the spot, the moment they were discovered, which was why she didn't understand what they were all forgetting here. But at that moment, without answering her questions, the man only poured a bucket of water on Vienna. After which, with a smile, he informed her that the bucket had just happened to fly out of his hands, and the latter grudgingly inquired for what purpose he had done it. But at that moment, the girl was being prowled through the bushes by angry and hungry wolves, who she had not yet noticed. And then Dr. Pepin Toth announced that he had finally been granted permission to check on her. Then, noticing Vienna's consternation, Dr. Pepin Toth, with a smile, continued that in these environs often roam ravenous predators, and if the medicinal water, which was now covered, the girl will provoke them even a little. But afterwards he told her that the girl had nothing to worry about, as he had prepared and arranged the archers on the perimeter just in case. But he warned her that a little blood would still have to be spilled. Even though it was the blood of the Great Witch herself, the predators had not reacted to her blood that had cooled down before. And then, scrutinizing a rather frightened and agitated Vienna, he said that now they could see what would happen if they smelled her fresh blood. At that moment, the girl immediately flashed all the memories related to Mlar, and the moment when he promised that if the girl did not tell him everything that had happened, he could just conduct experiments and test everything independently in order to find out the truth. But in the end, the pondering didn't last long, because the next moment she was attacked by predators who ran in an attempt to harm her. Of course, Vienna, in the goal of self-preservation, started to run away. But Dr. Pepin Toth, who was calmly observing all this, said that the predators would capture her anyway, so she should not provoke them once more. But afterwards, looking at the whole picture with a smile, he said that if the Great Witch could endure something like this now, she would be grateful to him in the future. But it seems that his words did not bother the girl, who did not even pay attention to them, because now she was panicking and trying to escape, realizing that no predator of this world would not harm her. After all, they only want her. But as soon as they taste her blood, they will immediately suppress their aggression. But even knowing this, Vienna still tries to run away, because what really scares her is not the harm they can do to her, but the cruel fate of the Great Witch, which repeats itself even in a place like this. After which, I remember Mlar, she realized that in all likelihood the man would want to use her, specifically her power, once it was confirmed. And after still running away, Vienna realized that she wasn't sure about Dr. Pepin Toth, but Mlar would definitely kill her the moment the results of the experiment were confirmed, and then they would definitely burn her at the stake, which she couldn't allow. But the next moment, by some great accident, she tripped and fell to the ground, rolling on it. And then an enraged predator ran up to her and clamped its teeth into her arm. The girl watched this picture in shock and fought the pain with tears, and realized that the other animals were still starting to attack, and couldn't believe that in the end even her death would be lousy. But the next moment, all the wolves stopped abruptly, glowing with white sacred fire, and backed away from the girl. And then Mlar, who had been looking over the whole picture, rose above her on his horse saw. As soon as the man saw Mr. Inquisitor appear so unexpectedly, Dr. Pepin Toth immediately approached and inquired how he had come to be here. But the man calmly dismounted from his horse and said that it was he who should ask Dr. Pepin Toth about it. Then, looking at the man, he said that it seemed that he had given him orders earlier that the Great Witch was to be locked up, and looking into Dr. Pepin Toth's shocked face, he expected some explanation. But when they did not follow, he looked closely at Dr. Pepin Toth, towering over the girl, and inquired why he now saw such a picture and what was going on here. The doctor only nervously tried to explain that he was carrying out the Grand Priest's orders, then frantically began to search for the papers, and finally held them out to the young man, informing him that this was the very permission in question. The girl was only frightened to see that this was the order of another person, and apparently Mlar, who she had suspected all along, knew absolutely nothing about it. The girl was still watching this picture while Dr. Pepin Toth explained that the letter said that the visit of the Great Priest would be delayed, and therefore he had ordered Dr. Pepin Toth to test the inhuman power of the Great Witch beforehand. But at that moment, Mlar simply tore the paper to shreds, reflecting that the Grand Priest had taken his measures much faster than he had expected. Then, standing before a shocked Dr. Pepin Toth, who could not understand how Mr. Props could allow himself such rudeness. But he only wondered with an evil grin if Dr. Pepin Toth had decided to make this whole spectacle just by relying on a single paper. Whereupon, to the great shock of the witch Vienna, He explained that the fortress they were now in and the Inquisition were subject only to him, and therefore it made absolutely no difference to him to whom Dr. Pepin Toth reported directly. But then he looked at him fiercely and said that he would not let him get away with disobeying his personal orders in his fortress, for it was an intolerable insolence. He immediately apologized awkwardly and said that he would be much more careful in the future, but Mlar said that he would pardon him only because he had torn the letter, but that he should not expect such mercy from him in the future. After which his gaze went straight to the girl, who was still wounded, sitting on her knees and looking at him intently, and she looked clearly lost. The next moment he pulled her by the arms and lifted her close to him, scrutinizing her face. Then, with the most serious look he could muster, he informed her that her legs were all right and asked why she was stuck in one place and still sitting on the ground. She only apologized in surprise. But after Mlar had saddled his horse, he informed all that they must return to the fortress at once. And finally, Dr. Pepin Toth and the girl followed his horse and set off leisurely. And no one even realized that the wolf who had managed to bite Vienna now, with brightly glowing scarlet eyes, was silently watching it all, hiding so as not to draw unnecessary attention to himself. In the end, some time passed, and in the evening the girl with bandaged hands and bandaged face was silently led into the room where the inquisitor was dealing with his affairs. So she thought she was alone in the room and took off her blindfold to look around. But in the end she saw only an unfamiliar room that looked like an office and started looking around. Then she sat down to look at the papers that were scattered on the floor. But at that moment she was approached by Mlar, who looked at Vienna and said he could not understand whether the girl was so brave or so foolish. Vienna only looked at him awkwardly and admitted that she didn't know he was here and apologized for that. But the man only looked at her calmly and said she could come over. Then he sat down in his chair and continued to do his work, not even looking at the agitated witch. But afterwards he did look away. He looked closely at her hands, which were covered with blood and all the bandages were stained, and asked if the girl had been treated properly. She only said, surprised by the question, that she had probably disturbed the wound on the way here when she had been yanked by the chains. He only turned away in a grudging manner and said that any slightest impact on the girl would make her bleed immediately, so he was madly surprised that she was still alive. Then he asked her figuratively to describe the appearance of the beast that had bitten her arm. The holy knight looked at her with interest and wondered how she knew that. But Vienna calmly bowed her head and said that it had always been like this. Otherwise, she would have gone mad long ago. After all, exchanging feelings with so many beasts was incredible. Then he looked at her more seriously and wondered if she couldn't even control a beast that responded. And yet she had given her body to be torn apart for some one-time connection. But Vienna calmly said that this sacrifice was to anticipate the threat that was coming to their land, and this threat could be, for example, a flood, an earthquake, or a landslide that only animals know about. At this point, Mlar recalled his interactions with the priests who had proved that the witch was madly wicked, for even natural disasters had bypassed them. And they were foul creatures, which was not in keeping with divine judgment. But at that moment, distracting him from his musings, Vienna informed him that Mlar really had nothing to worry about. For though she didn't know the exact time, she was sure that in a day or two this animal would be all done with. He looked at her calmly for a while and was silent for a while, not knowing what to say. But after a little thought, he said that if Vienna hadn't lied to him, she could stay here for a while. The girl was only excited. Looking at him, she wondered, would she really live here? After all, this room was his private office. But the man only grudgingly inquired, is this really what Vienna thought a private office should look like? Then stood up and massively towered over the fragile figure of the girl and said he was ready to say it again, and that for a while Vienna would live here, in his private chambers. She looked at him in surprise, not believing what she had heard, and explained as calmly as possible that such attention would not be necessary. But the holy knight looked at her earnestly and told her that he had no other choice but to be near her and watch her to make sure of this response, which was unknown when and how it would arise during sleep. She only excitedly inquired, Why would he follow something like this? Because, as she had said earlier, a response could arise at any moment. And he, calmly looking at such a disturbed high witch, bestowed upon her an attentive look, informed her that she would remain here until that response arose. Then, scrutinizing her, he informed her that Vienna could try to escape all she wanted, but she could not leave this room without his permission. So it was morning, and the girl was lying on the floor. And in the end, she shuddered at the creak of Mlar leaving, so she wondered if he was going to leave so early. Without even turning around, he confirmed her guess and said that he would be gone for a couple of hours. Then he said that if anything happened during that period, and was going to continue. But without saying anything, he turned the knob and immediately went out, leaving the worried girl alone with her thoughts. Then, pacing excitedly, Mlar thought about the fact that it had been exactly a week since he had put the Great Witch in his chambers, and this witch seemed to be absolutely awake, and he wondered every time why this was happening, and whether she was trying so hard to avoid responding. But eventually, he entered the room and saw the bound witch, and turned to one of the men who had tortured her and asked if this was the same witch who had been captured in the gorge. The woman only cried out excitedly and asked the inquisitor to release her, or at least not to torture her. After all, the Great Witch was the only one with true witch powers, and the other witches like her were not guilty at all. Then Mlar, stopping the man who wanted to continue her torture, asked the witch if, under the unique power, she meant a response to wild animals. She only smiled and said that apparently the man already knew everything, but suddenly he received another question, and Mlar asked why only the Great Witch is able to respond. The witch literally screamed and said that it was to predict the end of the world, because the Great Witch is a sacrifice. A sacrifice, in the name of finding the beast that will bring about the end of the world. Mlar was somewhat skeptical, but then the witch said that it was true, for the legend that a beast would one day appear had been passed down from the mouth of the Usta from time immemorial. And it would be a beast that would lead this world to destruction, and to prevent that from happening, a witch, with the help of a response, has to find this beast, and that's what she knew, according to this legend. But then, with a serious look at her, Mlar asked how exactly the witches were going to find him. And the witch, literally shaking from the pain of torture, said that if the beast did not die after responding to the Great Witch's call, it would mean that he was an incarnation of the devil intertwined with the witch. Then, looking at her carefully, Mlar asked what would happen after they found this beast, and she said that in that case, if they killed the Great Witch who was soul-bound to this beast, they could prevent the end of the world. Shocked, Mlar asked did all the witches slowly feed the beasts with her blood to stop the end of the world. And after this beast that would survive appeared, they were going to kill her. Then he squeezed her throat angrily and informed her with a furious look that he would rather believe that she was just making it up. It was more likely that she had made it up because she had a great grudge against the Great Witch than that they were taking her life so easily. Then, with scorn to go into, the woman will inform that the Great Witch has been captured, unable to find their beast, and soon she, along with the rest of the witches, will be consigned to the fire. And inquired. The frightened witch tried to say something, but Mlar calmly looked around and said that he no longer saw any point in keeping her alive. So he turned away and said that they could just kill her, and started to leave. But suddenly the witch cried out that they had another Great Witch besides this Vienna. But Mlar only calmly reported that he had heard earlier that there was only one Great Witch, and wondered if she had thought of telling him fairy tales again. But the witch calmly explained that this was not true at all, as the essence of the Great Witch is transmitted by blood, and not long ago, Vienna's mother had given birth to another child, and Vienna did not know about it yet. Then Mlar looked at the shaking witch and asked that since red eyes and all these abilities are transmitted by blood, then apparently Vienna's mother must also have such powers. But the agitated witch only said that her mother had long ago lost such powers, and so her last duty was to leave behind her descendants. But the holy knight only looked at her unhappily and informed her that although she was a witch, she could hardly get pregnant alone, and asked who the father was. Then the witch, shaking with fear, reported that it was not at all possible to find out who the father was, because the blood of a true great witch is not easy to inherit, so she had to get different families of different men until the real niece was born. Mlar didn't understand how it had come to this, but afterwards he admitted to himself that as much as it annoyed him, he could partly understand the Great Witch's position and her hatred for their entire race. Then the image of Vienna came into his mind, and he caught himself thinking that he used to wonder how it was possible to give up tribeswomen so easily. After that, looking at this witch, the man realized that now everything was obvious to him, because people like her really don't deserve to make such a sacrifice for them. So he calmly ordered one of his servants to quietly finish his work. After leaving the torture room, Mlar recalled what he had said and realized that it would be better if he didn't know about it, because now he had too many unnecessary thoughts in his head. But suddenly, just before he was about to leave, one of the knights came up to him and called out his name, asking how long Mr. Mlar was going to keep the Great Witch around. He was literally shocked by such a question and did not even understand how he could answer such a claim, so calmly reported that he did not understand with what intention the knight asked this question. Then the excited young man said that in order to purify Temthea, they no longer needed information from the Great Witch, and when the Grand Priest visited them, he should take the opportunity to return to the capital. After which he explained that the other priests were squabbling over the fact that Mlar had kept the witch for his own personal use. But of course his loyal soldiers did not hold such views and did not believe it. But afterward, the knight looked more determinedly at Mlar and asked, "Is the Great Witch so valuable that he is willing to tolerate such an insult, as well as the indiscriminate rumors about the Great Witch that have already managed to tarnish his reputation?" To Mlar, only calmly looking at him, informed him that the knight should not jump to conclusions, as the power of the Great Witch is not yet fully confirmed. And if there was a problem after they sent her to the capital without fully studying her abilities, all accusations would be directed in their direction. Then, looking at the agitated knight in front of him, Mlar informed that they were only doing their job, so the knight should not forget his duty and unnecessary emotions. Then, coming out of the place of torture, Mlar began to remember that the gorge and the hill were the places that Vienna had indicated, and stated that, having visited them, they had indeed found the witch's hiding place there, and consequently Mlar had no proof to assert that the witch had used the response to denounce her. After all, the only animals she could meet in the underground prison were rats, but with a single response she is able to survey the limited area of the outside world. Then, thinking about the Great Witch, Mlar came to the conclusion that she was apparently hiding another one of her abilities. Then he thought that if only the Grand Priest had not informed him of his visit, he would have been able to get to the bottom of it without paying so much attention to her. Then he reminded himself that he should not let himself forget his duty because of some unnecessary emotions. Then he began to justify this increased attention to the girl by the fact that the Grand Priest was due to arrive. But when he entered the room, he found Vienna lying on the floor, asleep after all, and looking over her, the young man wondered unhappily that it had been a whole week and she had finally been able to sleep, even though it was uncomfortable. But then, to his great shock, the girl began to move and to scream very loudly through her sleep. Looking at this with horror, Mlar absolutely did not understand how he should act. And then he remembered the conversation that had taken place between them, when he had asked what happens when a girl feels a response, and how it differs from her usual state of sleep. And she had explained in a perfectly casual way that during a response, the bite site would start to bleed. Then Fra began to quickly tear off her bandages with which she was bound early and saw that she was bleeding madly profusely. And I was in great shock to see Vienna in such agony, and I didn't understand. I wondered if she was going through it all like that. And looking over the scars on her arms, he realized that she had experienced this every time with each of these places where the scars were now. He smelled a strange odor that came from her blood, like luscious grape wine. At the same time, Vienna, in the guise of a wolf, ran through the forest and noticed a traveler sitting by the fire to warm himself. Then she attacked the man, and of course she was defeated, for she was stabbed in the stomach with a huge dagger. And at that moment, through the pain, she began to come to her senses. Then she woke up abruptly and, in tears, began to convince herself that these were not her feelings and that she had not really acted as she wished. She continued to cry and did not come to her senses, so the worried Mlar tried to bring her to her senses. But she did not respond to his call, so the young man called her by name only the third time in the 6 months they had known each other. And then the great witch finally responded and came to her senses.